Hello, my name is Mark Taylor, and welcome to the Education on Fire podcast. The place for creative and inspiring learning from around the world. Listen to teachers, parents and mentors share how they are supporting children to live their best authentic life and are proving to be a guiding light to us all. Hi, Emmy. Thank you so much for joining us here on the Education on Fire podcast. Great to chat to you again from over the pond, so to speak, and delighted to have you with us.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
So take us into the Jelly Bean book series. Tell us sort of in a nutshell what it is and where it came from.
Well, these are my books, and Adventures of Jelly Bean and the Further Adventures of Jelly Bean. And my book 3 should be coming out, hopefully not in too long. I know it's at the publisher. It takes them a while to do the edits, and we go back and forth. So my books, which I actually had started 60 plus years ago when I was in fourth grade, and my teacher would call me up to the front of the room. And speaking of teachers that are memorable, she was just wonderful. This Mrs. Trenham, I remember her very vividly. And when she had downtime, she would call me up to the front of the room. I would tell these stories, which people I went to fourth grade with still remember. And she was a mischievous little forthright fourth grader, and she would have all kinds of adventures. And that's when it began. And she evolved through the years when I had time to work on my stories, and I started writing them down. And she has 3 older brothers, and she meets challenges that are typical, sort of. But is anyone really typical? She is, she learns through trial and error how she wants to feel about things, what she wants to do about things. She has conflicts along the way with her parents, with her brothers, with schoolmates, with friends, with popularity and how much she wants to do to be in with certain people, how much she decides she doesn't want to do, what kinds of activities she really does want to continue with, what she doesn't. And she becomes like a do-gooder. Well, that's not even totally accurate. She sticks up for the underdog. She learns to do that kind of thing after going through a lot of things, adventures and misadventures herself. And she has a best friend that her parents don't approve of, which is a pretty common situation. And how she wants to go up against her parents or not, who don't want her. They have their own valid reasons for not wanting her to be with this person, which happens in a lot of families, whether it's a girlfriend or a boyfriend or a friend that they don't approve of. That's kind of the crux of those 2 stories, but she also deals with a lot else, as I have just gone through. And I guess that's why people consider my Jelly Bean books relatable and inspiring, people have said, because she learns to, the book makes you think, as my main character learns to just navigate her world, which we all need to do in one way or another.
Yeah, and I think that ability to identify with something that you're seeing or something that you're hearing means that you don't feel so alone, doesn't it? And like I say, that just
Right.
enables you to be able to think, oh, right, so no matter how I'm feeling or how maybe, like you say, someone else is interpreting what you should be doing or not doing or how you should be behaving, if you can see it in a book, or if you can see it in
Mhm.
another surroundings, then you can kind of go, oh, okay, so it's a different world for different people in different situations, and actually how I learn
Right.
to be myself within that is going to be put you in great stead as you go forward, because we all know with that sort of hindsight and that experience, life doesn't look the same for
Yes.
everyone, and every situation and every age is slightly different.
Exactly. That's what makes reading so. I was always a big reader and I always loved writing. And in both, you do figure out your world and
Yeah.
realize that you're not so alone. Everybody's going through something, at least one something at a time. And how you figure these things out is always the crux of the matter.
Yeah, exactly. And so how did that sort of fit within your sort of your life up to this point, because you haven't been a sort of a fully fledged author for your professional career. So how does that sort of professional history up to this point then sort of turn into the ability to sort of be able to create the books?
Yeah, it's so interesting because I always loved reading and writing, but through the years, like many or most people, I only had X amount of time because I was in school and then working and teaching. And then I got married and had three kids of my own, and that, was raising them and um, helping take care of sick parents after a while. And I taught during my teaching career. I took a few years off when my kids were three children when they were small, but I started with elementary and then middle school and then high school and then college, which I like the best. And I taught a variety of subjects and a variety of types of learners, and it all gave me so much of a perspective on what different children are going through and different households and how they, of course, influence the child and then young adult who's growing up there. And anyway, I like teaching writing the best. That was my favorite. And then COVID was, like, the pandemic was bad as it was kind of my silver lining, because that's when I finally sat down, finished my books, and sent them around. And publishers, had some rejections, of course. And then this publisher um, liked them and published them, and they became pretty popular. Now I've switched publishers, but for what it's worth. And as I said, now they're coming out with my book three, and I am working on my book four.
Wow, and I'm curious because one of the things we talk a lot about on the podcast is the kind of the education system as is, in terms of
Mhm.
what people tell you have to do. Governments say it has to look like this, testing, all of that kind of stuff. So, from your experience of sort of teaching across different age groups and different subjects, did you sort of feel that the sorts of things you're now sort of tackling within your books aren't really brought to the attention of children in schools generally, and maybe they shouldn't be. Maybe it should just be the academics, and you learn the rest of it elsewhere. But I'm sort of curious as to sort of what your experience was with that, and then sort of how that's sort of taken forward.
Right. I mean, I feel like with testing now, at least in the United States, I do understand why they have to do it. They have to make sure. I mean, I could go on and on and on, but that kids are learning a certain amount on and are at, hopefully, presumably, a certain level. Many aren't. I did special ed for a number of years, and it's very tricky to tackle this. At the same point, having all that testing and having to teach to test doesn't make life easy for a lot of the teachers and for a lot of the students, but you do need to do it to see where the gaps are and to know what you have to work on more. Although, as we were touching on, when the children go home and some have difficult households where the learning is not reinforced, um, that's a whole nother bag of worms because, you do your best to teach the children the best you can and in the most effective ways that you can. And some is going to work for some and not for others. And it's tough because even when I taught at college, Montclair State, which is a good school near here, I had to give presentations in how to succeed in college, test taking tips, how to write a research paper, um, tips for memorizing, and a lot of these skills that a lot of the students are lacking. And you just have to do your best to instill these ways of improving themselves. I mean, you're always, if in the large classrooms, you're going to have some sitting there sleeping, which isn't great. Um, some are avid learners. Some will come back a second time to hear a certain lecture. It's always a mix, and it's how you get to everyone that's critical, and that's tough.
Yeah, because it's really, like I say, sort of the special education side of things. I think often there can be, like I say, other extenuating factors which are causing an issue, and actually just being able to say I'm focusing on this or focusing on that from an academic point of view kind of is just sort of not really helping in lots of ways, because you need that space and that ability to find out more about what's going on to then put everything in place that that pupil probably needs to move forward.
Right. That is tricky because, as I said, when people blame the schools or teachers, I don't know. I don't like it because so much is the homes. From my empirical experience, that's what I've found. I mean, there are a lot of, some that aren't so terrific, but there are a lot of wonderful teachers out there who do their best. And of course, each child is going to have different abilities, but each one goes home to a different home life. Some are encouraged, some aren't, and some are what should I say, overly, um, extremely prodded to do their best. Others is the complete opposite. And some are right smack in the middle, but have a wide range of abilities. So it's education is tricky. It's our
Yeah.
future, but it's challenging.
And I think I was chatting to my wife about this earlier, about not specifically just sort of learning and education, but sort of generally when you're sort of engaging with children. And it's so often you think you have to do the right thing, and like certainly within schools you've got, like we just said, the structure and the things that you have to do, but so much of it is about that. If you're being sort of real and authentic and being sort of who you are, I think you'll
Mhm.
find the right thing to say, find the right way. And like I say, it will look different day to day, it will look different child to child and each situation. And you kind of, I think that's what people feel like when you're just doing the best that you can, because you're picking up on different bits of information, you're showing up in a different way. And I think realizing that sort of pupils can see you as a human being as well often then kind of breaks down some of those barriers. And I think that's one of the good things, especially when sort of the earlier years where you have sort of the same teachers for sort of a period of time, a year or so. It gives you that chance to kind of build those relationships and hopefully sort of foster some of those good habits and understanding of life. Again, like you say, you're sort of trying to sort of support in the book.
So interesting. All true. And for example, if some students would come to me, because I also worked at the tutoring center at my college, and when some kids would come in and say, "Oh, this teacher this teacher that, and I can't believe she did this or did that," it was so, a big thing is it was unfair. Well, okay, I would say everything you just said to me and you consider unfair, you need to don't just go up to your teacher, they're a person too, and start telling them your opinions and your feelings. And some you're very justified in. You have to ask them or email them in advance, what is a time that you can sit down and talk to me? And you have to figure out how to explain yourself. Like, communication is so important, and it's also tricky. And as you said, teachers are human. Also, you can't approach someone when they're heading out the door and they do have a personal life and something might be going on for them, or they have to get to their children, or they have a doctor's appointment. No, you have to, which is hard for a lot of people, develop the patience to be able to wait till the time. Well, hopefully it'll be, would be soon in those cases, and speak to them and find out what you need to do. And hopefully they'll meet you halfway with some course of action or remediation to help your situation, assuming that most children want to be successful and not, deep down, even if it's not on the surface, and they want to just complain and they're feeling upset about whatever's going on. I had a lot who came to me and how come I only got a C, or what can I do to get an A, which is very tricky with writing because
Mm.
in my curriculum and my rules, my instructions for writing, to get an A, which was hard in college, your writing has to be elegant. Now, how do you go about, you know, trying to accomplish that? I'd say A, and so many kids, as you know, now are on their, including, I have 7 grandchildren, and including them, they're on their tablets a lot. I'd say you have to read. You have to read a lot and try to, not plagiarize, but mimic a certain style. So if you don't know a word, which a lot of kids obviously are reluctant to do, but my dad always taught me, if you don't know a word, you have to go look it up and then try to use it. So that's one way to improve writing that I
And
tried to teach.
yeah, and I think it's really important that that sort of nugget that you said there in terms of, a child feeling supported enough and secure enough to ask those questions. And it's certainly a
Mhm.
conversation we've had with our children before. It's that kind of, what do you want at this moment? Do you want to know how to, like, say, to get an A or whatever the grade happens to be,
Mhm.
or how to improve, or how to kind of maybe even move a date of something with some work that's got to be in because you know that you've got other sort of extracurricular stuff that's going to maybe get in the way of doing that. And to actually
Right.
not be, I'm just going to keep my head down and hopefully no one's going to sort of look me in the eye, but actually say, no, this is me, this is my situation, and this is what I'm asking for. They're great skills, aren't they? And you can incorporate that within the normal learning scenario, but you kind of have to
Mhm.
sort of foster that environment, I guess, to kind of support them to do it. And then, like you say, encourage them and meet them halfway in order to help them sort of hopefully get the confidence to then do it the next time and the next time and the next time.
No, you're exactly right. And they have to, such an important skill for life. Like, I would talk about this a lot in my classes, learning to communicate, meaning, uh, sounds succinct, but putting your opinions and your feelings and your needs in a what such a way, you always have to go for clarity that someone else can understand. Like, you can't just say, this isn't right, or this isn't fair, or I'm upset about this. You have to say your reasons, be able to say them clearly, which takes work. Then you also have to listen to how the teacher's, hopefully in a good way, responding to you. And also, it's attitudinal as well. If you're going to be belligerent, and if a teachers are human, is going to feel as if they're being attacked, that's not going to work. Number one. Number two, you have to, again, say your thoughts and feelings clearly and in a concise manner. You can't be all over the place. So it takes work, but it's such an important skill, whatever field this person would end up in, whether
Yeah.
they're in sales, or whether they're a lawyer or a doctor or a teacher or a tradesman. You have to be able to, you have to learn to express yourself and
Yeah.
listen.
Yeah, and taking that sort of back into your books, Obviously, don't give away anything you don't want to do. But is there's sort of an arc of that, and some of these trials and lessons, which is sort of they're sort of going through. Do they come to a natural sort of conclusion, or is it more kind of this is an experience, and it might look one way, it might look another way, and sort of how they sort of
Mm.
identify with that?
Well, that's so interesting because, right, not to give too much away, but her best friend, who's such a loyal friend, and she's so lovable. And this just sort of happened organically as I was writing it. She has a totally different background from Jelly Beans. She's kind of from the wrong side of the tracks, as they say. And you you come to understand the parents' point of view. They don't want her being in a household, so to say, where the parents aren't around very much at all. And, the little girl struggles, but she's so admirable, as you can read in my Jelly Bean books, and Jelly Bean just gravitates towards her and loves her. And you can presumably see the reasons why, but you do also see the parents' point of view. So nothing comes to a great resolution, but you have to follow it to kind of see the ups and downs, which is like life. Then there's also her oldest, she has three older brothers. The oldest one wants to, which is generally not a parent's first choice, drop out of high school. And Jellybean observes all this and their conflicts over that. He, well, spoiler alert, joins the military. And this takes up a lot of the parents' time and energy, which can be hard for other children in a family. For whatever reason, a child demands or commands the lion's share, let's say, of parents' attention. Is tough for the other kids. So there's that going on in her life. And then the grandmother, who, well, I make her so wonderful, being a grandmother of seven myself. And she, this is also sort of why I feel like the generations are so important, because she has a totally different perspective on life, on everything. And she helps Jelly Bean a lot. Well, A, with just being there. Usually frequently parents are so busy with work and with their other children and with their own lives and their own needs and health concerns and so forth. And the grandmother is able to put more things in perspective and help Jellybean's mom with dealing with her, because sometimes she gets so frustrated when Jellybean doesn't want to do what she's told to do, which most children don't always do that so readily. And she listens to Jellybean. So that's also there.
Yeah, and I think the real sort of takeaway I get there is you sort of mentioned sort of painting a picture almost of what life looks like from those different perspectives, and I think
Mhm.
that's a great lesson to learn as well, or sort of the jigsaw puzzle sort of coming together. Sort of, I hadn't realised that this is this is my world over here because it's not been my focus. Because why would you understand necessarily what your parents are going through, depending
Of
on
course
the
not.
age, so
Right.
that's going to be the case, and it's only as you start to get older about that. But I think I'm always sort of thinking that if children aren't aware of it, or there aren't sort of age appropriate conversations around some of those things, then how are you ever going to know? And I think like I say, it can be a tricky thing to do, but it's why I love the sort of the opportunity to chat to people like you who are kind of sort of making that difference in a way that children can come to it in their own time, without the kind of the sort of we need to have a conversation, or sort of, well, there's obviously something we need to be talking about. It's a much
Yeah.
more organic and a much more kind of friendly way of understanding the world around you.
Yes, because I know I did learn a lot from my grandparents, and that was really great because they had been through so much and had a lot to tell and a lot to teach. And it's also a lot of what you were saying about reading. that takes you through other people's perspectives, and you learn so much through that. And that's why now in places where books are banned, that's so sad, because you're not going to learn anything or other from certain perspectives. And that's a shame. You don't have the same learning. You're prevented from seeing these other points of view, which are really, really important.
Yeah, and I think for me as well, there's something about a book which is very personal and sort of inward looking as well. And I think we know almost across the board, it's only when you sort of look inward and you understand yourself that that changes your outward understanding as well. And the great thing about a book is it's very personal, it's very tactile, and also it happens at your own rate. You know, how fast you want
Mhm.
to read, how many pages you want to read at a time, how I'm going to, do the whole thing over a weekend or whatever. And so you
Mhm.
really do have a lot of control over what it means to you. And I think there's very few mediums that allow you to do that.
Oh, that's a good point. True. And you can reread some parts if you want, if you want to go back, and if something kind of gets you, or you need to understand something a little better. Or say you're reading and your mind kind of drifts off somewhere else,
Mhm.
and you're like, wait a second, I need to come back and see what that character's up to or what that character had to say. Like, I think we've all kind of had that feeling like,
Yeah.
let's see what really happened there.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned before about that sort of influential teacher, but is there an education experience or someone else within that sort of time frame that sort of had an impact, and why was that?
So as I said, she was wonderful, this fourth grade teacher. And from different things I remember, and as I said, for me, because I'm 71 years old and this was a long time ago, but it lodged in there. Well, we had to memorize and get up and say a poem every Friday. And that was helpful as a mnemonic device, but also learning from these different poets who were from quite a while ago. So she was Mrs. Trenham. She also said, you have to, this is so funny, but buy clothing that you can do yourself, that you don't need help with, in case you're alone one day. And that kind of stuck in my mind. That was one of the many things. And then I had other wonderful teachers, especially in English. This one, and a lot of people I went to school with found her memorable. She was very strict, this Mrs. Molding. And I remember we read in her class, do you know Ethan Frome? The
No.
book by, definitely read it. It's wonderful. It's by Edith Wharton. And that had a lot in there. And we read some Shakespeare, which I didn't really appreciate until I had to teach about it. And that helped me a lot. And of course, I showed some of the movies, that different versions that went along with it. But as far as other teachers, so I learned so much from her. She was extremely strict, and but she was very good. And then I had another class. These are all high school teachers, but they were wonderful. And after teaching myself, I began to see all that went into it. Like my art history teacher, can't think of her name, but she was very good. And now when I look at art, I can't draw. I can barely draw a stick figure. I can't draw it. It's not Jean missed me, but she was so good and so knowledgeable from the ancient Greeks and Romans up till more of the present day. And she just taught us a lot. And we had a great trip to the cloisters. If you've been here, if you it's
No.
in New York State, very worthwhile going to. It's like a wonderful museum, and it has beautiful artwork arrayed in such wonderful ways. And I could appreciate it more. As I said, I can't draw or paint myself, but um, it was all worthwhile and I could appreciate it. And I had a music appreciation teacher I used to be okay on the piano, but it's kind of besides the point. I haven't done my writing instead. But he was very good also with giving illustrative little stories, snippets. Like he said, I don't know if he was a musician himself, I'm not remembering, but I remember he said it was about a Schubert. It's so beautiful. It goes da da na 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 na. It's famous, something like that. Not much of a singer, but and he said that the first violinist turned to whoever was next to him or to the conductor and said, "I'm going to cry," because it's just so beautiful. And so he was memorable, and had a lot others. One who taught poetry, and luckily, my dad, who I think just loved helping me pick my college courses, I think even more than I liked it, he helped me a lot with that. And trying to think what he encouraged me to. Oh, so I had a lot of friends naturally whose parents just wanted to prepare them for a job, which of course makes sense. But I was lucky in that my parents always wanted me to be more well rounded, and I think that helped me become a writer.
Yeah.
And my dad was a writer also.
And I'm just curious, sort of having been a teacher, and you sort of, you mentioned a number of teachers there that had an influence, which I love. What is it that you think, if you had to sort of encapsulate it, makes a good teacher? Because, like you said, some of them might be strict, some of them might be very soft, some of them have got a passion in their thing. Is there sort of something which kind of each one
Mm.
of them has that maybe is sort of that sort of common thread?
Oh, that's so interesting. Well, I could tell you for starters what a not so good teacher is. I know one of my sons, I said, "Oh, how did your presentation go?" Or your whatever he had that he had to get up in front of class. He said, "Oh," I said, "How'd your teacher like it?" "Oh, he was sleeping." I said, "Really?" And he said, he was in high school, so I mean, I love him. Thank God he's very successful now. But he said, "Well, he was hungover." I said, "Like, what?" Okay, that would be an extreme end of what you shouldn't be. Now, for a good teacher, you should know your subject matter, but also, this is tough with all the testing and so forth, be willing to be flexible. Like, I know sometimes, and I guess this is maybe like a comedian, sort of, but you kind of have to read the room. And
Mm.
sometimes you're thinking, wow, this is really great what I came up with, peeling back the onion and showing the relationships and so forth. But if you're presenting something in a way that's not going over very well, you have to switch it up and either come in the next day and try something completely different. Well, I know one thing that helped me a lot, for example, and someone else gave me this idea, but you have to be pretty brave also to get evaluations from the kids, from your students, either after every class or at the end of the week, something like that. Well, and you really only learn the most from criticisms, like all the ones which I was grateful for that, like, wow, this was great. I love the blah, blah, blah. That's all well and good, and that's all wonderful. But I remember one when I was teaching sixth grade and I had the kids do evaluations, and I didn't make them put their names, but of course I recognized the handwriting
Mm.
back in those days when you wrote things, and not just on your laptop. But this one girl wrote, "Mrs. Pollack goes on and on and on." And I was like, oh my God. Here I think I'm being so terrific and so wonderful. And that really resonated. So it taught me, and teachers that do this are great, to incorporate what the boys and girls have to say and value what they have to say. Try to find a way to compliment them if you can possibly can, so they'll be encouraged to participate more. So that's another
Yeah.
key thing.
Yeah, I love that. It's not something I've come across in that way before, and it really does make so much sense. Yeah, I really love it. Um,
Mm.
what's the best piece of advice you've ever been given, or indeed, is there a piece of advice you might give your younger self now, looking back?
Mm. Well, my both my parents had really, really good advice, and my dad said for one out of many, always keep a perspective. And it's so important because sometimes you're so caught up with something that's going on, something that upset you, something that made you angry. And, I think about that a lot. If you try to put something in its place in your history or in general history, and know that this too shall pass. And he would help me while with writing. And, sometimes when you're stuck or you're blocked, which happens to all writers, he'd be just move your hand across the page. And I tell that because I give advice a lot to wannabe writers and students. And now I go into the schools and I give presentations anywhere having to do with my books. And I tell them, just even if you're writing I, something will come. And if you because I took a lot of courses in, not now, now I just have to sit down and write, but I had taken writing courses in the past. And one was along those lines of just write something that happened to you today. Even if you toss the whole thing out the next day, if you think it's terrible, you just have to keep up that muscle, so to say.
Yeah, I love that. It sort of changes the energy, doesn't it? And changes the, like I say, the flow of everything, and yeah, it makes
Yes.
such a big difference. Is there a resource that you'd like to share? And this can be personal or professional, and anything from a video, song, book, podcast, film, but something that sort of had an impact or strikes you.
Oh, well, certain films definitely. Well, along with certain books, but I could go on and on about
Mm.
that. But if you did you ever watch the movie or hear of it, Renaissance Man?
Hmm.
Did you ever watch it?
I haven't watched it, but I do know of it. Yeah.
So good. Okay, so, and I always tell my own kids this. It's all in the how. Like I could tell you the plot or the bare bones of any movie or book, but you have to read it or see it for yourself to really get the full import or impact of it. So Danny DeVito, he doesn't want to become a teacher, but he does because he's out of a job and he needs to make money. And he goes to the unemployment place and they send him to become a teacher in the military. And he starts off, it's always good, the stories where they start off at such a low point. There's no place to go but up. And that's in, a really good plot, any type of plot. And he becomes such a good, inspiring, and inspired teacher. And he ends up teaching the lowest kids, but they need to pass this to keep their jobs in the military. Ends up teaching them Hamlet. And he finds such a good way to do it. And this really influenced me a lot because it just shows what a change in attitude can do and just how to just improve yourself. And the students change him and he changes them, which is the best story because they both have a positive effect on each other. So that's
Yeah,
one.
and I think that's such an important point, isn't it? Is that no matter where we are in that sort of education world or the learning world with people around us, is it is a journey together. It is hand in hand, and you
Yes,
never quite know what you're getting from it and what your pupils or the people around you are getting from it, probably until afterwards. But when you realize that it's for both of you, not just you and not just for them, I think that changes sort of what you believe you're even trying to create, let alone how you teach.
exactly. So his name in the story, I had shown it bit by bit to certain groups of students when I taught college. And this one student at the end, he goes, the guy's name is Mr. Rago in it, played by Danny DeVito. I actually grew up near me, but besides the point. He said, you're our Mr. Rago. And I was like, wow, that's like a great compliment because, he turned into this really, really good teacher. And I was, oh, when I taught To Kill a Mockingbird, you've read that.
Yeah.
It's so wonderful. And there's so much in there. And it was just wonderful teaching about this to putting it in a way that the boys and girls could understand. I mean, they didn't know what the Great Depression was, they didn't have a lot of background knowledge or information. Naturally, I guess. I guess they hadn't come across these things. And I loved teaching, well, the Odyssey and the Iliad, and we made games to show them coming around the board and these, and just there were so many lines from the Iliad, like especially pertinent in, well, these days, but war is, it's so timely and timeless.
Mm.
War is old men talking and young men dying, and it's so apropos of, a lot that goes on. And I also taught the book Night by Elie Wiesel.
Yeah, I've not
And
come
it's,
across that.
sorry?
I've not come across that.
Oh my God. It's about his experiences in the Holocaust. And it's state mandated in New Jersey now to teach about the Holocaust, which a lot of my students hadn't even heard of. So we spent a long time on that, and we just talked about different issues with man's inhumanity to man and what goes into. We had great discussions about, it's just so important to make the students think. Like when you said what goes into a good teacher, that's key. Um, What about saving yourself? What about saving someone else? What about fighting against injustice in the world? And how do you go about it? And Jelly Bean, she is a big supporter of the underdog.
Yeah,
So
I
that's in
love
there
that.
too.
Yeah, fantastic. Now, of course, the acronym FIRE is really important for us here on the podcast. And by that, we mean feedback, inspiration, resilience, and empowerment. And you said how important feedback is already, but what else is it that sort of strikes you when you hear that?
Oh, the first is fire.
So the first is feedback, is the F for fire.
Oh, well, um, okay, like my evaluations, which, oh my God, you have to be willing to take criticism. You're saying as a teacher.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. And in life, I mean, it's so interesting because if I would complain to my mother, my parents are long gone. I mean, they're recreated in my stories, but um, if I would say, "Oh my God, someone did this or something did that," and she'd say, "Well, what did you do?" Like, in other words, what did you do first? And I'd be like, who wants to go there, but it was good because it made me have to examine my own behavior or what I had said. And I always think about that. That was extremely helpful. These things that are so hard to do, but you need to. And the I is inspiration.
Yeah,
Yeah, my parents were so really inspiring to me. Like they really, and I only came to realize this in later life. I think I was talking to you about this a little bit. I would go to other households and listen, everyone has their, something they're grappling with, let's say. But I remember seeing sometimes like these really crabby and cranky dads, and I'd be thinking, wow, like that was not how mine was. And sometimes you take, well, speaking for myself, but so much for granted that you grow up with. And I was like, I'm not saying my household was perfect, but I had a pretty idyllic childhood. And parents got mad at me when, need be, but I was just so fortunate. to have parents that were loving and kind and laughed a lot and danced around with us and loved each other and us. And that was just so fortunate. A lot of people don't have that. So I'd say they were my inspiration
Yeah, yeah, no, I love it.
primarily.
Yeah, and I think it's such an important thing, isn't it, to experience other people's worlds, and I think you only sort of really appreciate yours sometime when you can see the other side of it, or a sort of a
True.
range of what that may look like.
Exactly. Oh, most definitely true. Like when I think about my grandmother whose husband died, my one grandmother whose, well, my grandfather died way, way, way long ago when she happened to be pregnant with my uncle. And just thinking how she wasn't a complainer. I think in that generation, they just didn't complain. They just went, they just did what they had to do. And now thinking about it, I'm like, it was really inspirational. Because what's the point of sitting there being my other grandmother who made it through the Depression? And they just had they each, she and that grandfather of mine, they each had to take two jobs, whatever they could get, and they had to make it through, and they had small children. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah, you do what you do and you make the most of it, don't you? And I
Yeah.
think it's a really amazing thing to be able to identify with, like you say, in terms of that experience, and how that I'm
Yes.
always fascinated how that sort of filters into how people live now, and especially younger people now. But of course, you only know what you know, and the world's a very different place than it was 2 generations ago. So how can
It's
you know, like you say, until you sort of try and help paint that picture?
it's so true. I know every now and again when, and I love my children, and I really believe the child's the father of the man in that line from the poem. I think it was Browning, but I could be wrong. And they've taught me so much. So they're inspired. And I learned a lot from my students, like you're saying, about different households. And once I went around my classroom in when I taught freshman English in college, and they each had to write about a conflict. Okay, so we're going around the room saying, what conflict are you writing about? What? By the end, I was in tears. What some of these kids were up against. I've been kicked out of my house by my stepmother, and I'd say, well, when are you allowed back in? Never. One girl who had to raise the younger children by herself because the mom had taken off. Just like different things that I was in awe. Like, wow, you're coming to one girl who had to have two other jobs, how she kept up with her college work, I don't know. And just things that people are up against. Like you say, it's very valuable to. Oh, another book actually that inspired me. If you ever heard of The Sad and Tragic Life of Robert Peace,
No, I haven't.
Peace. Oh boy, that'll catch you up short. So he had a sad and tragic life. Okay, he had a full scholarship to Yale, but he was of color. He was from Newark, and he had so many advantages, but he slipped back into something that he was familiar with from his background because his dad was in jail. His mom had to work a lot of hours, and he ended up being involved in drugs. And it's a tragic story, but it was heart wrenching.
Hmm.
It got you, you know?
Yeah, I can imagine, and I think that's why sort of the books that you're creating, and opening up those conversations and those ideas, especially at that sort of younger age where you can start to piece together, how you want your world to look, maybe, and how you can identify
Mhm.
it with what you can maybe just see certain themes going through which are going to support you as you go through, are so incredibly important. So, Emily, thank you so much for chatting with us today. Do let everybody know where they can find out more about you, and the books, and all that kind of thing.
Okay, so my website is, and thank you, Mark. My website is www.amypollack.com. You can find out all about me and my books, and yeah, they're available on Amazon. Of course, that's the quickest way, naturally.
No, lovely, Amy. Thank you so much indeed. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you. It was my pleasure.
I really hope you enjoyed today's conversation, and thank you so much for being part of the Education on Fire community. Links and details of today's podcast are in the description. And if you would like to support the show with a small donation, that's a wonderful way to help me bring you more creative and inspiring learning. Please visit educationonfire.com/support. And remember, education is not the filling of a pail, but the lighting of a fire.